Adrienne, Edgar. She's a professor of modern Russian and Central Asian history at the University of California, Barbara. She holds a BA in Russian language and literature from Oberlin College, an MA in international affairs and Middle East studies from Columbia University, and a PhD in history from UC Berkeley. Professor Edgar's research focuses on Central Asia and on questions of empire and nation in Soviet history. Her publications have analyzed the making of nations in the Soviet Union, the experiences of Muslim women in Soviet Central Asia, marriage, family, and everyday life in Central Asia, and the evolution of race as a category and practice in the Soviet Union. Adrienne's first book, Tribal Nation, The Making of Soviet Turkmenistan, was published by Princeton University Press in 2004. She co-edited the volume Intermarriage from Central Europe to Central Asia, Mixed Families in the Age of Extremes with University of Nebraska Press in 2020. And her second monograph, Intermarriage and the Friendship of Peoples, Ethnic Mixing in Soviet Central Asia with Cornell University Press in 2022, was co-winner of the Joseph Rothschild Prize in Ethnicity and Nationalism Studies. She has published articles on nationality, gender, and intermarriage in Slavic Review, Russian Review, Kritika ab Imperio. Sorry, something just popped up and blocked my screen. And Central Asian Survey. Her essays on Central Asian women in Pan-Islamic Perspective won the annual article prize of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. So that's quite a long and impressive introduction and career, and we're really honored to have you with us tonight. And I'll hand it over to you, and you can tell us about your topic is essentially about ethnic mixing in Russia, Eurasia, Central Asia.
That is correct. Thank you for the very nice introduction. And I am delighted to be here. I'm actually in California, so I'm probably fresher than you all because it's only 3:30 in the afternoon here. So although I was a little confused about the time difference, and about 15 minutes ago I said, is that talk at Harvard now or in an hour? And I looked at my calendar. I was like, oh no, it's now. So fortunately I'm here. So I have trouble with time differences sometimes. So anyway, I did a meeting this morning where one person was in England, one person on the East Coast, one person on the West Coast, and I think two of them in one day is almost more than my brain can handle. So anyway, delighted to see you all. How can I share my screen, Sandra? How would I?
Yes, you can go ahead. I made it possible for you.
Made it possible. Okay, let me see if I can. Hold on. Start PowerPoint here. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about nationality, race, and intermarriage in Soviet Central Asia. And this is basically, my understanding is that you guys read part of my book, like introduction or one chapter or something. Is that so that's great. So at least you kind of know what I'm doing. I'm going to kind of talk generally about my research, in this area that I did for this book, and also kind of try to relate it a little bit to broader trends in the region, in the Eurasian region. Oh, I should also mention, I'm sorry, my mind is jumping from here to there, but I also was a postdoc at the Davis Center for a year once. So I also have been there where I don't know if you guys go in person to the Davis Center, if it's only on Zoom, but I'm familiar with your center there. So.
Yes, that would, we should actually see, I made this mistake. I didn't even properly introduce myself, let alone introduce the rest of my colleagues. So this is a collaboration between the Davis Center, and then we have Zita, Alicia, and Sarah. And I don't know if Sarah can speak, but do you want to introduce yourself? So it's a collaboration between several universities.
Oh, okay, great. I didn't realize that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Zita, from University of Pittsburgh?
Sure. Hi, I'm Zita Tochago. I work as the engagement coordinator for the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at Pitt. I'm delighted.
Well, I've been there too because I'm involved with ACES, so which is at Pitt. Mhm.
So you know our neck of the woods as well, and I'm delighted to meet you, and I look forward to your talk and this very important and exciting topic to me, at least. I was very excited to read those chapters from the book, so I look forward to it.
Thank you. Okay, should I?
And
Yes,
oh, sorry.
please go ahead. No,
I
please
was
go
just
ahead.
going to
Please go
introduce
ahead.
myself. I'm Alicia Baca. I'm the outreach coordinator from the Center for Slavic East European and Eurasian Studies at Ohio State University.
Oh,
So
okay.
you probably maybe not quite as familiar with our neck of the woods, but it sounds like you've been in Ohio. So
Yeah, I went to Oberlin, so I'm
Yeah.
familiar with Ohio. So definitely. I haven't been to Ohio State though.
oh, okay, interesting.
Mhm.
And hi, everyone. I'm Sarah from the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia at UW-Madison, Krika. And Dr. Edgar, I missed your talk at Krika last year, so I'm thrilled that you're with us tonight. Thank you so much.
Great. Wonderful. So nice to meet you all. Anybody else?
That's it. That's our
Okay.
group, and we work together on this project for teachers, and we always meet on Zoom, except for once a year we pick one of the universities and meet in person.
I
So
see. Okay.
now
well,
that we're
you
all
know.
properly, introduced, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. So anyway, the Soviet Union, which is the country that I study most often, presented itself as a paradise of ethnic and racial harmony. During the Cold War, Soviet communist leaders frequently contrasted their own wonderful paradise of ethnic harmony with that of its Cold War rival, the United States, which was suffering from a legacy of segregation and discrimination that contrasted with the Soviet commitment to ethnic and racial equality. As evidence of the genuine friendship of peoples in the USSR, communist officials frequently pointed to intermarriage, frequent intermarriages among Soviet citizens of different ethnic backgrounds. And they noted that in the United States, by contrast, such marriages had been banned in many states until the Supreme Court struck down this ban in the late 1960s. Meanwhile, mixed marriages in the Soviet Union were said to be helping all the different ethnic groups and nationalities merge into a single Soviet people, which was a sort of supra-ethnic group, kind of a civic identity that was being created in the Soviet Union. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, much of post-Soviet Eurasia has moved away from ethnic and racial tolerance. Rising opposition to mixed marriages in many Soviet successor states are just a small part of this transformation. As you probably know, the region has experienced many conflicts and wars, as well as a rise in xenophobic nationalism and racism. There have been clashes involving Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Georgians, Abkhazians, Ossetians, and Russians, which have killed thousands. Russia itself has witnessed a surge of hostility and discrimination toward ethnic minorities from the Caucasus and Central Asia. And most egregiously, of course, it has invaded Ukraine, justifying extreme brutality and violence there with dehumanizing rhetoric that denies and diminishes Ukrainian identity and history. So today, people of mixed ethnic background in many former Soviet states find themselves torn between different parts of their families and forced to take sides. I think we can only imagine what it's like to be half Russian, half Ukrainian right now. How did we get from there to here, from Soviet internationalism and the friendship of peoples to interethnic hatred and war? My research and my recent book, Intermarriage and the Friendship of Peoples, try to offer an explanation, at least a partial explanation, by looking at the rise of racial thinking in the late Soviet period through the lens of intermarriage. In this talk, I'll try to highlight the key findings of my research on intermarriage and draw out what I think are some of the implications for our understanding of Soviet history and what's going on today. I do hope we can have a discussion afterwards about what you all think about this and how this relates to what else you've learned in this seminar so far. Even as the Soviet Union was celebrating, sorry, I'm not able to forward my slide. What am I doing wrong here? Okay, there we go. So even as the Soviet Union was celebrating mixed marriages and the friendship of peoples, the understanding of nationality in the late Soviet period was becoming increasingly primordial. It's a term that scholars use a lot, really means kind of biological, or you might say racialized. Nationality came to be seen, in other words, as an immutable and singular attribute of every citizen. All Soviet citizens, even those who were of mixed ancestry, were required to have a single nationality inscribed in their passports. And we can talk later about why that was the case. You might say that the Soviet state and its people were both internationalist and obsessed with ethnically defined nationality. And this is a kind of paradox that a number of scholars have pointed out. Here you have this is another image of the friendship of peoples, Soviet internationalism that was really touted by people in the Soviet Union. So in my talk today, I discuss evolving views of nationality and intermarriage in the Soviet Union from 2 different angles. First, I'll talk briefly about changing scholarly and official views on nationality and how these shaped views of intermarriage. Second, I will focus on what I think is the more fun or interesting part of my research, which is the lived experiences, the actual lives of mixed couples, mixed families, and the impact of these racialized conceptions of identity on their lives. At the end of my talk, I'll try to bring these 2 strands together to talk about how evolving views of nationality and race have affected mixed families in the post-Soviet period, going up to the very recent time period, and what the broader implications of this might be. So let me say just a few words before I go on about my research methods. That's the title of that's the cover page of the book. My research methods, where I did my research and how. So I did oral history interviews with mixed couples and their adult children in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. I also did some interviews in Russia, including interviews with social scientists, ethnographers, and sociologists who had studied intermarriage in the Soviet period, because I was trying to find out about their thinking about intermarriage. I also looked at the usual archives and documents and so forth, but I would say that this is my work on this topic is primarily a work of oral history. The reason being that I really was interested in knowing how people actually experienced mixed marriages and mixed families, and how that jibed with the official view. I mean, the official view was that mixed marriages were wonderful and happy and contributing to the emergence of Soviet people. So I kind of wanted to know, was that really true? And if I talk to people, do oral history interviews, what will I find out? And what I found out, I think, was interesting. I did the research in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. As I mentioned, I chose these 2 former Soviet republics because they are quite different historically, culturally, and so forth. Kazakhstan has an extremely diverse population, had an extremely diverse population also in the Soviet period, very high rates of interethnic interaction. So it offered a fertile ground for ethnic mixing, and it continues to do so in the post-Soviet period. Tajikistan was much more socially conservative, more homogeneous, and offered a less welcoming environment for mixed marriage in the Soviet era and also today. So I was kind of trying to pick two different places to see how the experience of mixed marriage and mixed families differed between them. So there were two periods. There were 2 periods when ethnic mixing became a particular focus of intense interest among Soviet scholars. The first was in the 1920s and early 1930s, when anthropologists and ethnographers sought to create new Soviet approaches to the study of human difference. In this period, Soviet scholars engaged with and ultimately rejected dominant Western paradigms of race and eugenics. The second period began in the early 1960s. In the late Khrushchev and Brezhnev eras, intermarriage once again emerged as an important topic for Soviet social scientists and nationality theorists. Between these 2 periods was the era of Stalinism, high Stalinism, when the idea that biology played any role in human societies and communities was roundly rejected, and any discussion of ethnic and racial differences was banned. So, and when I say that intermarriage became a huge topic among social scientists in the 60s to 80s, what I mean is every single journal that you would pick up about social science or anthropology had obligatory articles about ethnic mixing. Books on nationalities in the Soviet Union, published in the Soviet Union, had obligatory chapters on ethnic mixing. It was considered a very important topic, I think, because it was meant to showcase the success of Soviet nationality policy. So a recurrent theme in Soviet discussions of mixing and intermarriage was the interplay of the biological and the social in the making of ethnic communities. Is the ethnic group or nationality a biological organism? Is it a cultural and historical entity, or is it both? Is ethnic mixing primarily a biogenetic process or a cultural process? Until recently, historians tended to accept at face value Soviet claims that there was no race and there was no racism in the USSR. In fact, if you talk with most scholars of Soviet history today, they will say, yeah, race, not a big issue in Soviet history, not a big issue in the Soviet Union. In fact, the official Soviet view first formulated under Lenin and Stalin was that each Soviet nationality was distinguished by cultural and historical roots, not common descent or blood. In the first decade of Bolshevik rule, however, many Soviet anthropologists still subscribed to conceptions of racial hierarchy, racial pathology that were common in Europe at the time. Genetics and eugenics enjoyed great popularity in the early Soviet years. It wasn't until a Stalinist transformation of culture and academia in the late 20s and early 1930s that such views were repudiated and a new official Soviet discourse on race was crystallized. This meant the official Soviet position was that, race, the official Soviet position rejected ideas of race and rejected ideas that human culture was somehow related to biology, that it was innate, and that there were inferior and superior races. At this point, Soviet social science moved away from Western Soviet social science as represented by many US scholars of eugenics and so forth, as well as German Nazi scholars. So by the mid-1930s, it was already clear that the Soviets were in favor of ethnic mixing. They had a favorable policy toward intermarriage, and they rejected racial thinking broadly. However, and this is the big however, at the same time, there were signs that a more primordial understanding of nationality continued to operate within the Soviet Union. Again, we can talk later about why it continued to operate, even though it was not being explicitly discussed. Even as the Soviet academic world was being forced to abandon so-called biological thinking about nationality and ethnicity under Stalin, events on the ground were actually moving in the opposite direction, reinforcing a view of nationality as inherent and as an immutable quality of each individual. I don't want to say too much about this, but one of the signs of this primordial racial view of nationality was the surge in ethnic deportations under Stalin, starting in the mid-1930s, when entire ethnic groups were deported en masse away from border areas. They were stigmatized groups. They were considered dangerous or treasonous or having potentially treasonous relationships with their co-ethnic across the border. So there were deportations of a number of different groups, starting in the 30s, then throughout World War II. And when you consider that these groups were deported en masse, men, women, children, disabled people, elderly people, everybody. It kind of shows this kind of collective punishment shows really that a new approach to nationality had taken hold, and that nationality was not seen in these necessarily seen in these kind of cultural and historical terms, but as something innate to everyone who belonged to the group. And this view of nationality as inherited and immutable was formalized in a new, descent-based approach to passport nationality. So in the Soviet Union, people had internal passports. And this was an identity document. And one of the things written on your identity document was your nationality. It was obligatory. Nationality in the Soviet Union meant probably something like what we would consider what we would call ethnicity in our society. It wasn't your citizenship, but it was your background, your ethnic background. So nationality might be Russian, Ukrainian, Uzbek, Georgian, Tatar. You had to have one of those. Jewish was also a nationality. You had to have one of those listed in your passport, and you can only have one. these passports first came out in 1932 as a way of keeping track of the population at the time of collectivization. And initially, people were allowed to self-define their nationality. You know, you could go and say, well, you know, you could say, my mother was Georgian, my father was Tatar, but actually I'm Russian, and no one would argue with you. But the secret police very quickly got rid of that and declared, first in the late 30s, then in 1941, that it was obligatory for people to take the nationality of their parents, and that a mixed person was obliged to take the nationality of one of their parents. They couldn't just decide they were something else or both. So this, I think, again, is showing that ethnicity, or nationality as the Soviets called it, was seen as hereditary and almost biological, in the words of Albert Byburin, who's written a book about the Soviet passports. And this idea of, ethnicity as being something inherent, nationality as being something inherent in the individual, kind of inborn, was an idea that came to be internalized by Soviet citizens. This approach to identity continued after the war, with further ethnic deportations and rising anti-Semitism, its most obvious manifestations. So after Stalin's death, just very briefly, the Khrushchev and Brezhnev period saw the further growth of primordial understandings, biological understandings of nationality among scholars. And particularly this guy, Julian Bromley, who was an anthropologist, head of the main anthropology institute of the Soviet Union, he began using a term called the ethnos to describe nationalities. And what the ethnos was, it was actually an old Greek term, but picked up by Soviet anthropologists to describe human communities that ostensibly maintain their distinct identities over centuries or even millennia. So you had the ethnos as something very long lasting, could exist over thousands of years. And again, this kind of went against the original Soviet idea that nationalities, ethnicities are historical and cultural communities and not biological communities. Bromley, by the way, was very keen on ethnic mixing. He wrote a number of articles and chapters about it because he considered mixing between the ethnoses the way that all of these ethnoses in the Soviet Union would eventually merge into one big supra-ethnic Soviet people. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the scholarship on intermarriage and nationality and so forth. I want to talk a little bit about how these shifting and often contradictory ideas related to nationality and intermarriage were reflected in how people spoke about nationality, and identity in the Soviet Union, their perceptions and their experiences. It's important to note, first of all, that the officially positive attitude toward intermarriage in the Soviet Union was actually really good for mixed couples and families. Mixed couples and their children did not face social ostracism or segregation as they did in other countries. A mixed couple in the 30s or 40s could, in the Soviet Union, the 50s, could live a perfectly normal life. Even if they might face a few problems from their families and so forth, nevertheless, society was as a whole, the state was welcoming toward them. This was a time when, for example, a mixed black and white couple in the United States would have essentially faced social death. They would have been completely ostracized by white society and faced discrimination and segregation in various ways. So Soviet citizens were surrounded by, in fact, positive portrayals of mixed friendship and romance, which came not just from scholarly articles and Communist Party officials, but also from popular culture. And that brings me to this slide that I have just put up. There were a number of Soviet-era films that portrayed ethnically mixed romance in a positive light. And what's particularly nice is that many of these are musical comedies. So if you ever have a desire to watch Soviet musical comedies, I can recommend a few that deal with ethnic intermarriage. So for example, this one, The Distant Bride, Dalekaya Nevesta, a film from Turkmenistan, Ashgabat Film Studio, 1948. It follows a Russian army officer who goes to Turkmenistan during the war and falls in love with a beautiful young Turkmen horse trainer, who is depicted on the poster here. And after the war's end, he travels to Turkmenistan to try to find her and marry her. After the usual series of mix-ups and misunderstandings that you have to have in these sort of stories, the two eventually enjoy wedding bells and a happy ending. And there's another famous film. I particularly like this one. So it's called The Swineherd and the Shepherd is the Russian title. I guess people decided that was not a very appealing title for English-speaking moviegoers because they changed the title to They Met in Moscow. I guess the word swineherd doesn't go over well with film-going audiences. This movie similarly was about an interethnic marriage. In this case, it's a Russian peasant woman, Glasha, and a Dagestani shepherd young man, Musaib. You can see pictured here on the film poster. They met and fell in love at an agricultural exhibition in Moscow. In this film, Glasha has a would-be suitor, a Russian guy named Kuzma from his village, who tries to put roadblocks in the way of the romance with Musaib. But in the end, he failed, and Glasha and Musaib are united. Again, wedding bells, happy ending. There are many more like this, but I won't go on. That's enough, I think. I do want to mention, though, that positive portrayals of interethnic friendship and even romance were also seen in children's literature, children and adolescent literature. There was a book, The Wild Dog Dingo, which became also a film some years later, very popular, which features a romantic triangle among three young adolescents in the Soviet Far East. A Russian girl, Tanya, who you can see here on the right, falls in love with a Russian boy, Kolya. He's not pictured here. But meanwhile, Tanya's devoted childhood friend, Filka, who belongs to the indigenous Nanai nationality, is in love with her and pining away. Filka, who you see on the left here, was played by a young Kazakh actor named Talas Umurzakov. So in all of these books, and the story is kind of a normal story. There's no particular focus on ethnicity and nationality, but what all these stories show, what they teach children too, is that it's normal to be friends with someone of a different nationality or ethnicity. It's normal even to have a romance or fall in love with someone of a different ethnicity and nationality. These are normal and positive aspects of Soviet life. That was the portrayal in literature and in film. So was this the case in real life, though, as well? That's one of the things I was interested in exploring in my research. And what I found was that in real life, mixed couples and families were acutely and painfully affected by the growth of ethnic primordialism in the Soviet Union. In my oral history interviews, I found that former Soviet citizens often understood and spoke of nationality in racialized ways, even though they almost never used the word race. And in fact, it took me a while to figure out that what they were really talking about was racial, because they never used the term. And I'll give some examples that explain what I mean. Even members of mixed families, who might have been expected to have a nuanced understanding of identity, tended to describe the characteristics of national and ethnic groups as innate and immutable. They tended to accept the implicit existence of ethnic and national hierarchies, both within and outside the Soviet Union. By hierarchies, I mean, for example, that, if you ask people, who would you be okay with your child marrying? They will say things like, well, I would never let them marry an African, even though they may not know any Africans, but what they're saying is Africans are at the bottom of their mental racial hierarchy. And in many cases, people made clear that Russians were at the top of the hierarchy. So people seem to accept ethnic stereotyping as reflecting reality, describing Kazakhs as conservative and tradition-bound, Russians as heavy drinkers, Azerbaijanis as pathologically jealous, and Armenians as experts in making money. So these kinds of this kind of racial thinking, this kind of stereotyping, really emerged in three main areas with particular prominence in my research. And I'll try to talk just very briefly about each of them, make sure we have time for discussion at the end. So first of all, the identities of mixed children. And in particular, there were often discrepancies between the identities that children of mixed families claimed in their identity documents, their official identity, and their subjective identity, what they really felt themselves to be. And I found this especially interesting. Secondly, names and naming. it turned out, I didn't realize this when I started my research, but it turned out that naming children, giving first names to children in mixed families was a really fraught thing, and often was a source of conflict and fighting and so forth with in-laws and so forth. And finally, the use of language in mixed families, and especially the use of the Russian language in mixed families in Soviet Central Asia. So let me talk first about this identity question. Here's the Soviet passport I mentioned. It looks like this, and you can see that this guy. So right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this says that he's Russian, Ruski. It says his nationality there. Everyone's passport said their nationality. Mixed children, all children, but mixed children included, had to declare their nationality when they received their first internal identity document, their passport, at the age of 16. So kind of like driver's license ritual for us, where you go and take your driving test and get your driver's license, the Soviet child at 16 went to the passport office and got their passport. But when a mixed child arrived there, they were asked, well, which nationality do you want to take, mama's or papa's? And at that point, in many cases, the kids, first of all, they might not have thought about it ahead of time and they freaked out. Or in other cases, their parents had prepared them and they knew what they wanted to say. But in general, what you can say is that frequently the nationality that they listed on their passport did not coincide with their subjective sense of identity. This problem had a gender dimension, especially in the case of mixed marriages uniting a Russian woman with a Central Asian man, because in Muslim families, the children were commonly expected to take their father's nationality as their official nationality, even though they often identified more with their mother's culture, having grown up speaking Russian with their mother and their mother's mother. Often that was what they identified with. So let me give an example here. And this example is in the chapter that you read, but I just want to highlight it. A woman whose pseudonym in my book was Maria Iskanderova, mixed Russian and Azerbaijani. So Azerbaijan is a Caucasus republic, Turkic-speaking Muslim. So she's got two kind of mixed, a mixed background there between father and mother. Now, Maria said that she resembled her father physically. And her name, her last name, and her patronymic, the middle name that everyone in the Soviet Union carried, reflecting the father's name, her middle name and her patronymic and her last name were both Azerbaijani. And in her childhood, the discrepancy between these external markers of nationality and her subjective feelings of identity brought unwelcome comments from strangers. And as you can see in this quote, she got sick of the attention that was directed toward her. People would say, is that your mom? You don't look Russian. Who's your father? Lots of curiosity, which she found unpleasant because, it drew attention to her and that somehow she wasn't matching up with what people expected in the minds of people who saw her. Maria felt subjectively that she was Russian, that her culture was Russian, her identity was Russian, but she felt that she did not have the right to declare herself to be a Russian because of the way she looked, because of her name. And she thought that saying that she was Russian would make her a laughingstock. So she declared her nationality to be Azerbaijani in her passport, even though she'd never been there and she didn't speak the language and she didn't particularly identify with it. So I have other examples, but since you've read this chapter, I don't think I need to go into them. One thing I want to mention is that sometimes these identity problems went beyond simply a mismatch between subjective identity and official nationality to an actual feeling of alienation, toward one parent's culture. And again, you probably read this in the chapter, but Susanna Morozova, a mixed Armenian-Ukrainian woman, expressed fear of men from the Caucasus, even though her own father was from the Caucasus. She she wanted to marry a Russian, and she didn't speak Armenian, didn't identify with Armenian, and that really came out in my conversations with her. So despite her own mixed background, Susanna expressed highly racialized fears of men from the Caucasus, of men from Armenia, like her own father. So I wanted, chapter 5 was the one you read, right? The one on identity? of mixed children. Is that correct, Sandra?
Yes, introduction in chapter 5.
Okay, good. So so I just want to skip through this and go on to the chapter about names, since that's one that you haven't looked at. Naming mixed children. In this arena as well, considerations of phenotype and identity entered into the picture. And I had no idea before starting my research that this was going to be an issue, and I was kind of fascinated by how it played out, because it was also very different from what I was familiar with, what I grew up with, attitudes toward name. For example, when I grew up in the Bay Area, California, San Francisco Bay Area, I grew up in a very ethnically, racially mixed school. I went to a very ethnically, racially mixed high school, for example, and everybody had weird names, like a German first name and a, Mexican last name, or, Hawaiian first name and a, Swedish last name. This is very common, and a French middle name. I mean, people had all kinds of strange, interesting, mixed up identities, and we all thought that was normal, right? That didn't strike anybody as being a strange thing. However, when I interviewed people in former Soviet Central Asia, what I discovered was that people, first of all, thought it was very important that your name match. All the different parts of your name should match. You shouldn't have a Kazakh last name and a Russian first name. That would be awkward. What was also important was that a child's name should match the way they looked. So if you had a child who looked Kazakh, which means looking Asian, basically, with black hair and, and so forth, you shouldn't be named Anastasia or Katya, or kind of Russian first names. So this kind of desire for name matching, desire that your name should go along with your appearance, all of this influenced the way mixed couples, mixed families named their children. One woman told me that when she and her husband had their first daughter, they looked at her to see this was a mixed Russian and Kazakh marriage. This woman named Marina Abdurrahmanova said that, we looked at the kid when they basically popped out of the womb, and we tried to decide what they looked like, more like a Kazakh, more like a Russian, or something else. And so they had one daughter, an older daughter who looked Kazakh. They gave her one kind of name. A younger daughter who looked less Kazakh. They gave her a less Kazakh name. I kind of wondered about this. I thought it's not always so easy to tell when a baby is born what they're going to look like, but this was one strategy. Another strategy was to pick, which is mentioned here in a strategy that was mentioned here in Marina's quote, is to pick a name that is neutral, meaning, as she says, not purely Kazakh, not purely Russian, a name that is not strongly identified with one ethnic group or another. This turned out to be important for many mixed couples because they had parents on one side pressing for one kind of name, parents on the other side pressing for another kind of name. So they thought if we give something neutral and inoffensive, then we'll please, both of the parents. So the idea was to avoid conflict, but also that the child will feel comfortable in a variety of different ethnic settings. So one name that fit the bill as a neutral name in mixed families was the name Timur. Now, Timur is actually the same name as, we would call it Tamerlane. It's the name of the local name of the Central Asian leader from the Middle Ages. But Timur became a very popular name among mixed families in Central Asia in the late Soviet period. And there was a reason for this. First of all, it sounds good in Russian as well as in Turkic and Persian languages. It's a recognizable name for people in Central Asia, where it is actually originally a Turkic name, but it was also recognizable to Russians because of this book. There was a book that came out, I believe, in the 40s, originally called Timur. It was also a movie. Timur and His Squad is the translation. It was about a young boy who had a gang of kids, and they went around doing good deeds in their village. And so this name became popular among Russians as well. So this was considered a kind of ideal name to give to mixed kids because everybody liked it, everybody recognized it. So I cannot tell you how many Timurs I met among the mixed Kazakh-Russian families in Kazakhstan. In fact, when I would say, what did you name your son? I was kind of thinking to myself, 10 to 1, they named him Timur. And then sure enough, we named him Timur. So a very common name. There were other names as well that were like this. For example, Ruslan and Rustam are names that are common among both Russians and Central Asians. They are easy to pronounce and spell in both languages. They're comprehensible in both languages. And Ruslan is a character in a famous Pushkin poem, so it also has strong literary associations for Russians as well. So it has these are all names that have Turkic, Persian associations. These are languages spoken in Central Asia, as well as Russian associations, which kind of everyone else is speaking. So finally, let me turn to the issue of language in mixed families. Many intermarried couples wanted their children to speak perfect Russian. Even if they had, no matter what other ethnic groups were in the family, whether they were Russian mixed with something else, Kazakh, Tajik, so forth, or whether they were completely different nationalities, neither of whom were Russian, if there were, Ukrainian Armenian couples and Tatar Korean couples and all kinds of ethnic mixes in Central Asia. But in general, what I found was that people wanted their children to speak Russian perfectly, so they spoke Russian at home. Interestingly, it was most often the Central Asian fathers who insisted on Russian, perhaps because they knew from personal experience that speaking perfect Russian was very important for success in Soviet society, success in higher education, jobs, and so forth. But for children who did not, quote, look Russian, end quote, speaking perfect Russian could be an awkward thing. It could provoke a surprised reaction from others, or it could pose identity dilemmas for the speaker. So here you have a quote by, again, Maria Iskanderova, the woman who was mixed Russian and Azerbaijani, who said, who frequently encountered the assumption, based on her appearance, she looked more Azerbaijani, more Central Asian or from the Caucasus, dark hair, dark eyes, and so forth. She encountered the assumption that she would speak broken Russian or Russian with an accent, which really annoyed her because Russian was her native and only language. She said, and this is a quote from my interview with her, "My brother had it easier. He looked like both our dad and our mom. He looked more like a Russian." Going on. So people didn't react to him with the same curiosity as they did to me. Like I would start speaking and, "Oh, you speak without an accent. What nationality are you?" "Well, for goodness sake, why should I speak with an accent?" she said. So she was offended and, made to feel awkward by a mismatch between her physical appearance and the language she spoke. This is a kind of racialization, expecting a certain culture, a certain language based on phenotype, based on physical appearance. And yet, a perfect knowledge of Russian, which was normally a source of pride, could also be a source of shame in certain circumstances. In Kazakhstan, there are many Kazakhs who speak perfect Russian and don't speak Kazakh well. Russian has become a new adopted native language for them. And many of my ethnically mixed respondents expressed regret about their failure to learn the language of their father, be it Tajik, Kazakh, Uzbek, or Azerbaijani. One of my respondents, whom I will call Sultanat, a Kazakh woman married to a Russian man, recalled an incident on a train when she was quite young. They were traveling in a compartment with two military men, Russian military men. They were in Russia and on a trip. And when they stepped out of the compartment at one point, they overheard the officers speaking. The younger man said, "They speak Russian so well without any accent. I wonder where they're from." The older officer, the colonel, said they could only be from Kazakhstan. Only Kazakhs speak Russian so well and without an accent, which is sort of a strange thing to say because, of course, there's another group of people who speak Russian well and without an accent, and that's Russians. But what the officer was saying was that, in spite of not looking like Russians, in spite of the way they look, Kazakhs speak, and in spite of their background, their descent, Kazakhs are able to speak perfect Russian without an accent. And so my respondent said, "I'll remember this observation for the rest of my life. It was shocking for me. Even though Kazakhs have," she said, "Mongoloid," what she meant was Asian, facial features, we speak Russian clearly with no accent whatsoever. Well, let me tell you, my education, all of it was Russian language. Of course I speak Russian without an accent. If I speak on the phone, no one would ever know that I'm Kazakh. I explain myself in proper and literary Russian." Sultanate was upset not only at being taken for a foreigner whose Russian language skills were surprising, but also at the implication that Kazakhs had betrayed their true identity by exchanging their native language for Russian. This implied a kind of fakery or inauthenticity. The problem with being Kazakh and speaking perfect Russian was that one would never be mistaken for an ethnic Russian or fully accepted as such. Speaking perfect Russian and being able to pass for Russian on the phone for Sultanate, as she noted, was a bit like, I compared it with what scholars have written about sounding white for an African American. If someone says that they sound white and it implies that, why do you sound, there's something wrong, you should sound differently because of the way you look. It did not change her fundamental identity, and it raised doubts even in her own mind about her authenticity as a Kazakh. Okay, to conclude, do I have a few more minutes, or should I finish up, Sandra? I wonder if I should say a little bit about post-Soviet Central Asia.
Time. You have time. I mean, our webinar goes all the way to 8 o'clock, and we don't have much housekeeping issues. So just take your time.
Okay, so I won't skip over because the post-Soviet stuff is interesting. Okay, as long as I haven't bored you yet, I will say a little bit. So about the post-Soviet period. Okay, so I've tried to show the ways in which racial thinking in the late Soviet period insinuated itself into everyday conversations and decisions about issues as varied as naming children, preferring one language to another, and choosing a passport nationality. Examples from life histories of members of mixed families in Central Asia show the extent to which national culture in the late Soviet Union had come to be seen as something innate, biological, and immutable. In this worldview, an individual's cultural identity was not malleable, learned, or even a matter of choice, as Soviet officials had claimed it was in the 20s and 30s. Even if nationality had not exactly become race, Soviet thinking about nationality had become racialized. It's important to stress that this racialization of nationality, while widespread in scholarly and popular discourse, was not formally institutionalized in the Soviet Union. Unlike, say, the United States and South Africa, people weren't categorized by race in the census or in any other, instance. In this sense, the Soviet Union genuinely was different from its Cold War rivals. Moreover, exclusivist and racialized thinking about nationality always coexisted with internationalist thinking, a belief in the friendship of peoples and the emergence of a Soviet people. The tension between these two paradigms continued throughout the Soviet era and beyond. So what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed? Well, with the rejection of communist ideology and the promotion of national identities as the basis for statehood in all of the republics of the post-Soviet Union, in the post-Soviet space, the context for ethnic mixing changed significantly. And I'll focus again on Kazakhstan and Tajikistan because that's where I've done the research. In both countries, a new emphasis on traditionalism in marriage and family relations as part of a national and religious revival has made intermarriage more problematic. One of the things is that in Tajikistan, people, for example, people have overwhelmingly returned to arranged marriages, and often cousin marriages with first cousins. This doesn't go well with interethnic marriage, needless to say, because parents don't usually arrange interethnic marriages. In both countries, internal divisions such as sub-ethnic identities, regional differences, and rural-urban differences have also become more salient, in some cases more salient than ethnic differences. Moreover, in both countries, citizens now intermarry not just with other Soviet nationalities, but with citizens of other countries. The borders were open, or have been opened, and people from Central Asia now intermarry with people from China, the states of the European Union, Iran, Turkey, and the United States. Might have some images here. Yes, so this is from a website in Kazakhstan that did a special issue on interethnic marriage. And here you see mixed marriages in post-Soviet Kazakhstan. These two couples represent kind of the kinds of mixed marriages that were more common in the Soviet era. A Russian and Kazakh couple here. They're showing their flags, which I think is cute. A Kazakh and Tatar couple here you can see. And then these images show new kinds of intermarriage in Kazakhstan since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with Kazakhs marrying Canadians, Italians, and a Korean, Kazakhstani citizen marrying a Macedonian, and so forth. So you have all kinds of new mixed marriages appearing in Soviet Central Asia. So let me just go back to this this slide for a second. Even though there have been new developments that are similar in both countries, Tajikistan and Kazakhstan have diverged somewhat. In Tajikistan, there's been a lot of opposition to mixed marriage, a lot of talk about genetic purity, preserving the gene pool, not intermarrying with non-Tajiks or with foreigners. In Kazakhstan, at least officially, there's continued to be a Soviet-style celebration of mixed marriage and multi-ethnicity. However, even in Kazakhstan, there are Kazakh nationalists and kind of ethnic purists who believe that, you know, Kazakh women in particular should not intermarry, should not marry non-Kazakhs. So in both countries, in Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, there has been a certain amount of opposition to mixed marriage, which means that it's no longer as welcoming an environment for mixed families. And there, even in Kazakhstan, there's been, for example, anger about ads. This is an ad, a billboard ad in Kazakhstan that shows a mixed couple. It looks like a Kazakh guy and maybe a Russian woman. These kinds of ads used to be very popular because I think perhaps you'll notice this is kind of they seem to be showing how modern they are. They're in kind of a Western style saloon with a jukebox. She's holding a credit card. He's holding a cell phone. You know, they're like a modern couple, modern mixed couple. But these kinds of ads started to be heavily criticized by Kazakh nationalists in the Kazakh press and so forth. And another example, there was a movie called Irony of Love, which aroused the ire of Kazakh nationalists because it depicted a young Kazakh woman who dumped her oil magnate Kazakh boyfriend in favor of a penniless Russian academic. And a lot of people in Kazakhstan said, my God, why would anyone do that? This is an insult to Kazakhstan, an insult to our national feelings. And people even proposed that, you know, the Kazakh film companies stop, you know, financing films like this. So essentially the climate for mixed marriages in both Kazakhstan and Tajikistan has become much less favorable. This is true in many other republics, many other former countries of the former Soviet Union. There have been criticisms of mixed marriage in, you know, the Caucasus, in Georgia, in Russia. I mean, they're in Turkmenistan. I mean, this is not limited by any means to these two republics. So to conclude, intermarried couples in the Soviet Union believed in a future in which their children would be able to move beyond, transcend ethnicity. Unfortunately, this future never arrived for the mixed children of Soviet Central Asia, who live today in post-Soviet states that are dominated to varying degrees by ethnic nationalism and generally less hospitable to ethnic mixing than their Soviet parents and grandparents could have ever expected. The growth of biological and racial understandings of identity in the late Soviet period contributed, in my view, significantly to this transformation. As we've seen, race was not part of the official discourse of the Soviet era, nor did people use it in everyday conversation, but it simmered beneath the surface and was even embedded in the work of leading Soviet scholars and ethnographers, and of course in Soviet policies such as deportation and passport policies. On the popular level, racial thinking could be detected in the widely accepted essentialist understandings of nationality, stereotyped ways of seeing nationality based on supposedly innate characteristics. When I started this project, one of the things that intrigued me was that the Soviet Union had seemed to support and welcome mixed marriages at a time when the United States allowed them at best grudgingly. Wondered whether this attitude on the part, this tolerance, apparent tolerance of diversity and ethnic mixing was real, or was it just propaganda? I discovered in my research that it was to a large extent real. Mixed couples, mixed families did feel more welcome in the Soviet Union than they would have in many other places, say in the mid-20th century. Yet the growth of these biological and racialized understandings of identity challenged them and undermined this feeling of security that they had. Today, many of the post-Soviet countries are seemingly going backward, abandoning anti-racism in favor of exclusionary nationalism. Mixed families and even members of ethnic minorities no longer feel as welcome, let alone celebrated, as they did in the Soviet era. History is not linear, as we're finding lately, and progress toward equality and inclusiveness is never guaranteed. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to discussing all this with you.